Welcome to West Coast Workshop. In this video series, we'll be transforming a 1975 two-horse trailer into the First Sip mobile bar. Since this trailer has clearly had a hard life, as evidenced by the extensive rust and multiple significant dents, we'll need to start by removing the floor and stripping down the trailer to address the rust. To remove the floor, I mostly used a sawzall, hammer, and large screwdriver, but of course, I lost the footage, so like magic.
Alright, day 2 of trailer demo. I'll be grinding down the rust on the support rails, and then we'll get it prepped to weld on some new 2 inch by 2 inch angle iron, 1/8 inch thick. That'll help beef things up and make sure it's good to go when we get it back on the road. So let's start off by taking off the doors. So as you can see, we're pretty corroded in here. There's heavy pitting. I've already gone at it with a hammer and chisel and a grinding wheel, so I'm going to keep going at that, get it nice and clean. I'll repair some of the welds that are connecting the trailer skin to the support rail, and then we'll get this prepped to add in a new piece of angle iron there. That'll just help make sure that it's ready to support the load when we get it loaded up with all of the trailer gear, like the freezer, the kegs, the cabinetry, all that.
The 1/4 inch angle iron is heavily rusted and pitted, and at some point someone's made a poor attempt at repairing it with an arc welder by gobbing metal into the corner. We're going to reinforce the rails by adding another 1/8 inch angle iron, and we'll just weld that along the current existing support rails. Before we can do that, however, there's lots of grinding, and I mean lots and lots of grinding, and then some more grinding. Once the rails have been ground down, we'll spray everything with a rust converting primer. So this converts any remaining rust into a primer that will protect it from future oxidation. In a future step, we'll need to sand this back off in order to spray everything with a zinc-based primer before we weld. But for now, this will protect everything from the elements while I prepare for the welding.
So the other day I finished grinding down and putting some rust converter on the support rails. Today I'll be fitting up the new angle iron that's going to reinforce this. So to do that, I'll have to grind off most of the rust converter, but it'll stick in those deeper pits where I couldn't get the grinder. And then we'll spray it with some zinc-based weld-through primer.
Now I can cut and notch the angle iron braces, and I'll be leaving about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch of space around each of the vertical supports so there's room to weld the new supports to the old angle iron frame, as well as tie them into the vertical supports. Then I can drill the holes where I'll be adding some heavy spot welds. I'll step up from small to large bits to a final size of around 3/8 of an inch. For the larger bits, it helps to add a little bit of cutting oil to avoid overheating the bit.
Well, trusty old grinder, put in a lot of good work, but yesterday the spindle snapped on me, so it's just freewheeling in there. Luckily it didn't fly out in my face. But unfortunately had to stop work for the day and go get a new grinder. So let's cut to that. Well, here it is. One added advantage, I guess, is that for the first time in about 10 years, I actually have a handle and a shield. Threw mine out a long time ago back when I was using it on the daily, and they got in the way constantly. But it's gonna be a nice feature to have for finishing out the rest of the trailer. With that, let's get to work. I got to finish grinding out the old weld that somebody tried to repair the rails with, so I can get it nice and flat so I can weld in the new angle iron to support the side rails. Then we'll clean up the frame and get that ready for some pour 15. All right, today we're going to tackle welding in the frame supports. So that's just that angle iron that we cut up, the 2 inch by 2 inch, 1/8 inch angle iron. We'll weld that along the supports. So before we do that, we've got to clean up the rust converter, and then we'll spray everything with a weld-through primer.
Before the new angle iron can be welded in, it needs to be cleaned and degreased using a wax and grease remover. I've ground down the entire backside to make sure there's good adhesion with the weld-through primer. Unfortunately, the primer I got decided it wanted to spill its guts everywhere. I even tried multiple tips to try to isolate the problem, but it's just a bad can of primer. So needless to say, I've now made a huge mess of the trailer and my driveway, But at least the metal will be protected from corrosion, so we'll forget about the mess and carry on. Now I'll weld in the new angle iron. I've ground down and rounded the back of the angle so that they nest together nicely. But due to the rough patchwork that's been done to the trailer in previous repairs, we'll have to massage the metal into place using some gentle persuasion as it's heated up during the welding process. Once all the tack welds are in place, I'll run a bead down the whole seam. Now, I'm by no means a master welder, but with a little patience setting up the heat and wire speed, I was able to get some acceptable beads run with my little 120 volt flux core welder. I've got a lot more experience running larger MIG welders, but considering I'm welding outside, in the wind, there's going to be some rusty bits of metal still, and well, I don't have a larger welder and a gas bottle. This was the right tool for the job. While prepping the left-hand side, I noticed that there was heavy corrosion on one of the vertical supports. Before I can weld in the angle iron support, I'll have to cut out a section of that and replace it. Now, an important note is that I won't be able to weld all 4 sides of the replacement piece, so after I've cleaned up and painted the inside of the trailer, I'll go back and add some seam sealer to seal the edge butting up against the trailer skin. Rather than just notching out the tube like the existing support, I'll take the notched out piece, trim it, and weld it into the back of the piece so that it's still a complete tube. Once the left rail has been welded up, I can turn my attention to grinding the rest of the frame, and doing a little bit of sandblasting in the harder to reach areas, but oh boy does that make a mess. And it's finally time to coat the frame with Pour 15 rust paint, making sure to get adequate coverage using a horsehair brush. Nylon bristles will just dissolve. Ask me how I know. With the frame finally painted, I can move on to the next task, which will be doing some body work, cutting out the front separator, and prepping the interior walls for paint. I'm using a sawzall and grinder to cut out the front separator, and then later I ground down the tack welds and pried off the remaining strips of metal. Now I'm moving on to patching up the window and vent holes on what will be the back wall of the trailer. Since it'll be a solid wall behind the trailer, there's no need for holes, so to make sure everything stays watertight, I've cut some 14 gauge steel to patch the holes. I used the combination of a sawzall and jigsaw to cut the patches, but I used a blade on the jigsaw that was a bit too fine for the first circular patch and it was really difficult to follow my outline, so as you can see there are some rather large gaps that I had to fill with weld. But other than that it went pretty well and the other 2 patches fit fairly nicely.
So the next thing I'll be working on is some structural reinforcement in the front of the trailer where we're going to have the freezer and all the kegs. So I'll be adding in a cross member somewhere like that, a little straighter than that. And then a support running from this horizontal cross member to the front of the trailer where we'll also have to do some repair on that nice rusty section there. Then we'll be addressing the vertical supports that have been cut short, as well as disconnected from these horizontal supports here. So basically the skin of the trailer there isn't really supported by anything. So I've already tied it in to these vertical supports here on both sides. But that's pretty much the only thing holding those up other than being tacked welded to the skin. So I will add in some vertical supports running down there. And then at some point we'll need to address this horribly mounted hinge. So you can see it's popped off all the welds there. So I'll add a new hinge onto the door. We'll just grind off this old hinge, add a new hinge, probably clean up the inside of the door a little bit, get a new handle on there, and that should be it for the major structural repairs. Once that's done, we can grind down the inside of the trailer, give it a good sanding, and paint it.
Here I'm marking out the angle for the cross brace, making sure to have an even measurement from the rear frame to keep it square. Before welding in the longitudinal support that will help stiffen the trailer and provide a middle support for the future flooring, I need to patch up the front of the frame that is all rusted out. To start, I need to cut out some of the rusty metal from the skin to get access to grind out the rust from the frame and weld in a piece of 1/8" steel as a patch. I've slotted a steel bar so that it can bend around the curve nicely and also allow me to attach it to the remaining good steel on the front of the frame. I've also sprayed some rust converter inside the tube to prevent as much further oxidation as I can. After tacking the bar in place, I ran a bead along both long edges. I left the bar overhanging on the inside, which did make it a bit trickier to weld as I couldn't really see what I was doing, but I ground that down flush afterwards. Now I can weld in the longitudinal frame support and then add some vertical supports beside the door that tie into the frame, as at some point somebody cut the original ones out, probably to replace the floor. I've pre-painted these supports, but they'll later get a coat of Pour 15 with the rest of the trailer frame bracing that I've added. Finally, I can patch the skin using a piece I salvaged from the front separator. Using the magnets helps me to ensure that the patch starts level with the skin, and then I can use a persuader to help me form the rest of the curve. Off camera, I ground down the welds and did a bit more panel beating to get it into decent enough shape to prep it for body filler. Thanks for sticking through to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it and want to keep up with the rest of the build, please like and subscribe. In the next video, I'll be tackling some of the body work, repairing the roof, which you may have noticed happened sometime between all of the grinding because I had to stop it from raining inside the trailer every day while I was working. And then I'll be prepping the inside of the trailer by grinding and sanding it and getting it ready for some paint, which I'll be spraying some Trem-clad white gloss paint just to keep everything nice and protected. And if it goes well, I might use that for the exterior of the trailer as well.